I'm Scott Gordon. I'm a professor of English at Lehigh University. I'm also on the board of the Moravian Archives. Should I launch into it, Eric, or do you have other things to cover?
I think I do. I will just say as an announcement that the fourth Thursday next month is going to be Thanksgiving. So we'll be meeting on the third Thursday. And the question will be whether we'll be meeting at 5:30 to 7 or at noontime that day. We've had some folks who say they'd like to join us earlier in the day. I know that may mess up with schedules. We have traditionally had a lunchtime lecture. We could squeeze an hour in at lunchtime. I'll be sending an email around to our MSC list and polling them on what works best for an experiment next month. Scott Gordon joins us tonight. He's been working on Mary Penry letters for a while now, published a book in 2018. And I was excited to hear about that project. And I wanted him to share that with folks locally. And we'll be sharing that through this tape today with people who have not heard about his work and that wonderful collection of letters. So Scott, I will transfer the host duties to you and let you take the program away for the next little while.
Sounds good. Oh, I am the host. Okay. I'll just need that. I'm going to share some slides in a little bit. So it's just a pleasure to be here to talk to everyone today, or talk with everyone today. I know some of you have heard about Mary Penry before. Maybe this will be a reminder. Hopefully there's some new stuff. Often when I talk about Penry, as some of you know, I tend to focus on her singleness. Very few people remain single in early America, and the ability to remain single was a really rare opportunity offered by 18th century Moravian communities, and I am happy to discuss that. But I thought I'd use my remarks today to talk about something a little different, which might be you could call it Penry as a social networker. At the event that a number of you talked about before, the Zinzendorf opening here in Bethlehem, Paul mentioned that Zinzendorf would have loved Zoom because he was such a networker. And I think this is really true of Penry too. So I thought I'd talk about her a little bit today as a social networker. But for those of you who don't know, who haven't heard me talk over and over again about Mary Penry, let me describe who she is, or who she was. She was a Welsh woman. She was born in Wales in 1735. Maybe I'll just start the slides now. Let's see. Okay. So she was born in 1735. Her father died when she was very young, just about 5, and she and her mother emigrated from Great Britain to Philadelphia in 1744. So she wasn't yet 10 years old. They came to America because a cousin was married to this wealthy Quaker merchant in Philadelphia. His name was Atwood. So mother and daughter came to live with the Atwoods, this relative and her husband in Philadelphia. But the relative died very soon after the Penrys arrived, and the mother and daughter, Mary and her mother, remained in the home of this wealthy Quaker merchant, who turned out to be a very nasty man. He seems to have abused Penry's mother, who had a child with him out of wedlock, and then after that child was born, married him. And Penry hints, without giving really any details, that she was mistreated as well. She described her years in Atwood's house as an Egyptian captivity, which she really escaped only when he died in 1754. So after he dies, Penry and her mother, who seem to have been confined to his house, joined the Moravian Church in Philadelphia. And about a year after that, Penry visits, started in the wrong place. Okay, there we go. So in about December 55, about a year after they joined the church in Philadelphia, Penry visits Bethlehem, and she begs authorities to let her stay. Authorities warn her that Bethlehem was under threat from Indian attack. This is during the French and Indian War. But Penry says she prefers to brave the frontier in Bethlehem than return to Philadelphia. And she does finally get permission to move into Bethlehem's sister's house, which you can see there on the slide, in June of 1756. She lives in Bethlehem only for about 6 years, because in 1762, she moves to a new single sister's house in Lidditz, which was a closed Moravian community similar to Bethlehem or Salem. It was a very small place. In 1764, soon after she moves into this new house with the first cohort of single sisters, only 31 women live in the Single Sisters house. And she lived in that building that you see there for more than 40 years, a committed Moravian single sister until she dies in 1804. Her primary occupation for the community was as a clerk or a bookkeeper for the Single Sisters house, which had a textile industry and a small girls' school, later became a boarding school in the 1790s. Penry was responsible as bookkeeper for recording and reporting to church authorities all the sisters' business activities and for corresponding with customers about these activities, including the Franklins, who had been contacts of her when she was there in Philadelphia, and who purchased spun cotton from the Single Sisters in Lidditz. She also kept the diary of the Single Sisters house, which you see there on the right. And as all these congregational or choir diaries are, she describes in it the comings and goings of the Single Sisters. She notes spiritual milestones and religious ceremonies. She reports on arrivals and departures of non-Moravian visitors to Lidditz or to the Sisters' house. And she occasionally remarks on events in the world outside that affected the community. And she kept this diary every day for more than 40 years. She also served the Moravian Church at this time between, say, the late 1760s and early 1770s as a translator of materials from around the globe. She was given letters and diaries and reports and sermons, and then she would render them into English. So one might think that once Penry moved into a Single Sisters choir house in quiet Lidditz, that her story, or at least any story worth telling or interested in hearing, that would be interested in hearing, would sort of stop. One would think that her life there would leave few traces, little to remark upon except her daily piety. And some historians do continue to describe Moravian Single Sisters as cloistered or sequestered. And these historians are really repeating the impression that Moravian communities made on 18th century visitors, who often called the Single Sisters house a nunnery, or thought that Moravians resembled Roman Catholics, and regretted that the Moravians cloistered up, is the term, their single women. Penry's letters totally upend these assumptions. I guess I should say, before talking about how they upend these assumptions, that her letters do describe with amazing detail the spiritual life of an ordinary 18th century Moravian woman. And in part because she's writing to non-Moravians, she takes the time to explain things that Moravians writing to Moravians would have taken for granted. So she describes the communal eating arrangements and sleeping arrangements. She describes the labor that she and the other Single Sisters engage in. She describes the costs of everything: firewood, food, candles. She describes who does the laundry, the most mundane things that would typically go entirely unmentioned. She even describes in one letter how many panes of glass one of the windows in her room has, 35 panes of glass, in case you're interested. But her letters also do reveal things that we don't really, I think, expect from a Moravian Single Sister. For instance, she had an incredible passion for local, national, and international politics. In a letter to Elizabeth Drinker, she called herself a great politician. And it's very clear from Penry's letters that the partisan strife of the early Republic reached early America's small villages and even exclusive Moravian communities such as Bethlehem or Lidditz. She eagerly consumed and respread, disseminated political news, which sort of shows that even people who weren't activists or weren't going to be voters, women, for instance, were really energized by newspapers into becoming very committed partisans. Penry, I've said this many times, but Penry would be a cable news junkie if she were alive today. Her friends knew her political preferences, which were very conservative. She would be a Fox News junkie if she were alive today. She told one friend that she reads no Demos paper, no Democratic paper. She mourned when Washington, as she said, surrendered his office after 2 terms, She had reasonable hopes for John Adams. She despised Thomas Jefferson, and her disgust for figures like Jefferson and Thomas Paine, and for the French Revolution in general in the 1790s, even got her in trouble with the Speaker of Pennsylvania's Assembly, who overheard her at some gathering and worried that she would infect the girls at Littitz's boarding school with her very conservative opinions. In addition to this very energetic political imagination, Penry had also a surprisingly engaged social life. Surprising given what we sort of might assume about Moravian single sisters. She traveled a lot, for instance, to Bethlehem. Maybe we expect that, but she also went to Lancaster, and she went to Philadelphia, and she even went to Harrisburg, and she went to Baltimore, and she wasn't going on mission work. She was just going to visit friends from her life before she left the world to join a Moravian community. And she visited new friends that she'd only met because they had come to visit Lidditz. That was the cause of her visit to Baltimore. Travel wasn't really pleasant for her, but it's sort of fun for us to listen to her describe her unpleasant travels. In one letter, she says, "I'm very well when I sit in my chair, but can bear no fatigue, being very short-breathed, owing to my growing fat. I have been so fatigued from traveling the rough turnpike road that it seemed my flesh was bruised and loosed from the bones." She would pronounce every trip she took, trips to Philadelphia or Bethlehem, as her last trip. "I've given up all journeys," she says. "I've taken my final leave of Philadelphia," in 1794. But then, of course, she'd continue to travel there for many years. And on these trips, it's interesting, she didn't stay with Moravians. She stayed with her non-Moravian friends, her non-Moravian contacts. So one thing these letters show really strikingly is that the lines that separated Moravian communities from the communities around them were really, they weren't walls, they were boundaries, very clearly drawn boundaries, but boundaries that were capable of being crossed even by Moravian single sisters. So Penry was able at some physical and also financial costs to visit friends in Pennsylvania and beyond. But it's really her correspondence, her letters, that enabled her to preserve and maintain and even extend her social networks. Her letters reveal the many affiliations that tethered her to the world beyond the single sisters' house, these deeply felt and persistent social ties with people beyond Moravian settlements. And these people included relatives in Wales, who I'll talk about in a minute, but also people that she knew from her years in Philadelphia, who included Benjamin Rush, who was the premier physician in early America, and Elizabeth Drinker, who I mentioned before, a prominent elite Quaker with whom Penry had gone to school. Their teacher was Anthony Benezet, the abolitionist. And these letters themselves are the surviving traces of her abiding connections with non-Moravians around the globe with whom she maintained these intimate relationships. It's clear from her letters that the social and emotional life of a Moravian single sister, or at least this Moravian single sister, was not limited to her relationship with the family of women with whom she lived, or with her savior. Penry must have been at her desk writing nearly all the time. As I mentioned, she had lots of work to do for her choir, business correspondence, keeping accounts, producing other records such as membership catalogs, and not to mention that daily diary that she wrote in every day. But besides this, she was writing these personal letters to correspondents around the globe. If only she was writing on a computer, we could track her screen time, which would have been enormous. All in all, I was able to find over the last 6 or 7 years that I worked on this project, about 80 letters that Penry wrote, scattered in archives all over the world. And she didn't write short notes, no postcards from Mary Penry. The surviving correspondence, these 80 letters, amount to over 100,000 words. It's an astonishing amount of writing. And as vast as that surviving correspondence is, we know that much of it, probably most of it, is lost, or not yet recovered, perhaps we should say that. In these letters, all these letters contain a mix of politics and religion and gossip. The mix is different in every letter, but all those things happen in almost every letter. And a really good example is the one letter that's in your archives in Salem, which is this letter here. It's a letter that she wrote to John Gambold, who at the time she's writing was the leader of the Single Brothers Choir in Salem, but he had served the same position in Lidditz, where Penry had got to know him. And it's a very interesting letter. It's just one page. It's not one of the longer letters. And in it, you probably can't read it on the screen, but she conveys a lot of gossip about who's died and who's married, including one very scandalous marriage. Let me just read to you what she says there about in this letter. So again, she's writing to Gambold. She says, I want to tell you that young Peter Ricksecker went off from Bethlehem, where he had been placed, and Gretel Frederick to Yorktown from Lidditz under the pretense of visiting her mother, and there they met and married. I suppose you will imagine this has given much trouble and uneasiness. So an elopement away from the Moravian church. So she conveys gossip in this letter, like most of them. But she also describes a much more serious and to us more interesting topic, I think, in this particular letter, which is the yellow fever pandemic that was devastating Philadelphia in 1793. And here's what she says about that. Same letter. She says, the poor Philadelphians are dead or dying by 50s, hundreds, and 300 to 400 a day, and the disorder not yet abated. We can hear very little from thence. None are suffered to come to Lancaster, nor indeed anywhere, without performing quarantine. Those who have forsaken the city and locked up their houses are likely to be great losers in their property by thieves and robbers who plunder where they can. Billy Wistar, who fled to Lancaster, being desired to return to the city, his house was in danger, answered, if I lose all I have in the world, I cannot go. I am not prepared for death. So the letter, this letter that you folks have, is an amazing snapshot of how a population dealt with a pandemic more than 225 years ago. As is the case with our own social networks, Penry's postings, her letters, helped her not only to maintain connections with people she had known in person, such as Gambold, but also to establish connections, including one with the Penry family in Wales that she had left with her widowed mother, as I mentioned, when she was a very small girl. She didn't know this family, but her mother died in 1760. Penry was about 25. She'd been settled in Bethlehem in America for about 15 years. And she felt orphaned, and so she wrote to her father's family in Wales. And she said in the letter, though so far distant and perhaps forgotten by her friends, I have no other motive to write you but filial affection. I ask no other favor but a few lines in answer to this. She wanted just some acknowledgement from them, and her letter sort of generously offered information about herself and about the strange Moravian community at Bethlehem in which she was living at the time. And the letter reached her cousins, and they didn't reply for 33 years. Only in 1793 did these Welsh relatives reply to the letter that they received in 1760. And as a consequence, Penry really felt abandoned for most of her life. During all these years, family basically reminded Penry of the fellowship or intimacy that she lacked. When the letter from her Welsh relatives did arrive 33 years later, Penry was ecstatic. It is not in my power to express the heartfelt pleasure your dear letter gave me, she wrote. Imagine to yourselves how great must be my joy after almost 49 years to receive the first line from my dear father's family, for whom and for my native country I have ever had strong predilection. And for the next decade, from 1793 or 4 to her death, a real correspondence flourished between Penry and these three relatives, her elderly uncle, a cousin at her own age, and a young niece, all of whom lived in the same house. And reading the letters in sequence, you can really feel Penry become comfortable with these relatives that she would never meet except via correspondence, her version of Zoom. They developed real intimacies. As a postscript to one of the letters, she told her relatives that 6 kisses are here enclosed to each of you, and 4 from my uncle. My lips have been, as it were, glued to the paper more than 20 times. To these relatives, Penry described her dream of being in Wales and meeting them, but she knew that that was just a dream and that the correspondence would be their only connection. And so in letter after letter after letter, she tells her relatives about her friends, and she learns about her relatives' friends. She discusses with her niece whether in the afterlife friends such as they are would meet each other. She commiserates with her relatives about their poor health and her aging. And after a while, you can hear the elderly Mary Penry, who had always felt like an abandoned girl, begin to believe that she has a family. It was really a gift given to her in her last decade, thanks to her networking, that she had despaired of for most of her life. So on May 4th, 1804, Mary Penry wrote for one last time in the diary of the Single Sisters house. And you can see there on the slide her handwriting at the top. Another hand completed the entry for that date. Penry had been sick on and off for about 6 months, and she'd written encouraging letters at Christmas and after New Year's. On March 31st, 1804, she wrote that although she had been ill, the worst was over, and she was absorbed in the routine business of reporting on the Single Sisters' financial affairs, as she did every spring. She was balancing the books, basically, and she was still working. Her very last letter, describing severe health problems, breathing problems, did not reach her friends in Philadelphia until after her death on May 17th, 1804, so about 2 weeks after she wrote for the last time in the diary there. She'd lived 68 busy years. Her will disposed of the few personal effects that she had possessed, some books and pictures and clothing, the bulk of her very small estate, including some silver teacups and some saucers and a sugar dish that she'd used to host visitors in her little room, remained in the Single Sisters house so the women that she had lived with could use them. 4 teaspoons she sent to friends, and her silver watch traveled across the Atlantic to her Welsh niece. But her most valuable legacy, at least to me, had already been distributed, which is her letters. And thankfully, her correspondence saved them, or some of her correspondence saved them. And as I've tried to suggest in these brief remarks, her letters reveal almost uniquely the life of a single woman in early America. And as important for students of Moravian history, they show the sorts of personal and social networks that Moravian women created and cultivated. Far from cloistered or sequestered from the world, Mary Penry traveled widely in the world. And even more so, she used her correspondence, the most social media that she had available to her, to maintain friendships with these non-Moravians that she knew from her childhood and youth in Philadelphia, and also to extend this network, just as we do, to people she would never meet, but with whom, nevertheless, she came to form very intimate bonds. Her letters reveal, as our own experiences on social media do, including Zoom, that urgent human need to connect with other people. That's pretty much what I wanted to talk to you about today. I'm happy to answer questions, have a further discussion about Penry. Let me try to get this slide off my screen.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Scott.
I'm going to stop sharing. There we go.
Yeah.
Hi.
We just finished a conference called Becoming American.
Yeah.
And I read this book and I thought Mary Penry's trying to become Welsh.
Yeah, you're
She
exactly
really
right.
wants to reconnect with her home.
You're so right.
And that Welsh identity and the family of her father, that
Yep.
connection was such a fulfilling thing in her life
Yeah.
And it's interesting in the early letters to her friend, for Betsy Drinker, when she first writes her, it's almost kind of a form letter. And by the way, I need to write letters to my friends of means to help us build the expansion on the sister's house. And it's not a very personal letter. And yet then she follows it up with decades of Chez Ami, and she reconnects with her in a very personal way.
Yeah.
The sources of where this project started, it looked in the Moravian history. There's an antecedent to Mary Penry. You're not the first person to look at her. Sometime in the early 1915, there was a Moravian article that gathered some. Tell me about that article.
Yeah. Well, I'm happy to talk about both of those things. You're dead right that bizarrely, since she never lived in Wales, or she lived in Wales until she was 4.5, she doesn't remember Wales. Right. What she really wants to be as well. She repeats often to her relatives, "Stop calling me your American niece. I'm Welsh like you." And she has some pretty critical things to say about the American dream. She's very conscious of sort of immigrants being lured over with false promises, and she talked to many who ended up destitute. She always said she was lucky because had it not been for the Moravian choir houses, she would have been one of those immigrants lured over with false promises and really having no place to go as a refuge. So I think you're exactly right. Her Welsh identity, strangely for someone who didn't remember Wales, was very strong. Right, so about the archival history, a historian or a librarian historian at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania named John Wolfe Jordan discovered, I think initially, Penry's letters to Drinker, which were probably I forget where he found them. They were either at the Historical Society or still in a family collection. And he took those letters and he gave them to Linden Hall, which is the boarding school that still exists. And that uses the single sister's house where Penry lived. So Jordan had found a batch of letters from Drinker, and from Penry to Drinker. And I think that was his first awareness of Penry, and he was clearly aware of her name. And then at some point later, in ways that he never described, he found that a batch of her letters survived in Wales in this Parsons library. Her cousins somehow must have, or they must have passed on after her cousins passed into this minister's library. And from those letters, he published excerpts of about 15 letters in the newspaper. I think it was a weekly newspaper, if I remember correctly, called the Moravian. It was published here in Bethlehem. And they're very, to us, sort of brutally edited. So every bit of religion is taken out of these letters. He really was embarrassed by that. And he wanted to turn Penry, as I say in the introduction to the book, I think, or I've said it somewhere, into a curious historian like himself. And so he quotes all of her incredible descriptions of early America, but he takes out all of her deep, deep piety, which is really the dominant strain in all of these letters. And that was it. In a afterword or a little note in the Moravian after the last excerpt that he published. So he published the excerpts. After the last excerpt, there was a little note in the Moravian that said something like, Mr. Jordan is working on a book or is going to there was never anything more. He lived for many more years. He never published any more of the letters. His papers have really survived, and there's no record of a manuscript. And interestingly, he published the ones to her relatives in Wales. He didn't publish any of the ones to Elizabeth Drinker. And those two batches, the batch to Elizabeth Drinker, which is still in Lidditz in the Linden Hall archives, and this batch of letters to her Welsh cousins, which is in the National Library of Wales, that's the main body of what survives.
I've got two other questions, but I'm going to pass along to anybody else with questions.
Scott,
Oh,
when I reflect on the sisters in Bethlehem, I have an image of the sisters working, singing, and praying.
Mhm.
And does Mary fit into that, or is she different with her connections with the whales and her travels?
Yeah. I think that's the $64,000 question, which is how representative is she?
Right.
And I really don't know the answer to that. I suspect she's not representative, but I don't think she's unique either. I mean, I think she did do all the things that you mentioned. She definitely prayed, she worked, she sang, you know, she had social life with her sisters, and she mentions them in all her letters. So I think maybe I overstressed in my few remarks that all of her sort of intimate relationships were outside the family of sisters. She was also very intimate with her family of sisters. I don't really know how, I mean, she does talk about traveling with other Moravian sisters. A number of her travels have to do with the families she's met through the young girls in the school in Lidditz. So when she goes to Harrisburg, she's going back with a couple of the students to spend some time with their families. But it's hard to know without, and I should say in her diary, she describes a lot of comings and goings of the sisters, although it's usually to Moravian places like Bethlehem or a close town like Lancaster. One could probably go through that diary and get a better sense of just how much they all traveled, because again, her job is to record when people leave and when people return. I haven't really done that. There's a lot of comings and goings.
I have a friend who is sorry she's not here tonight, but she has done read all of the diaries of Drinker. And so she has, you know, that view from the other side of, and so that connection, that's there.
One of the really fascinating things is, and I wish we could know more about this, I tried my darndest to learn a bit more before publishing the book, but I just couldn't, is, so Elizabeth Drinker, as Karen just said, she's an elite Quaker who kept a diary for 60 years, and that's been published in 3 very large volumes. And Penry went to school with her. Another of the schoolmates was a woman named Hannah Sampson, who married a guy named Callender. Her diary has also been published. So these 3, and she was also in school with Drinker and Penry. So these 3 young women, you know, became sort of diarist record keepers for their entire life. Their schoolmaster was Anthony Benezet, the great Quaker abolitionist, who's well known for educating women and later for educating Blacks. But this particular educational experience of Penry, Drinker, Sampson, and actually men as well, because this Pennsylvania politician, Timothy Matlack, major radical politician during the Revolution, he was also in this school. But this is in the 1740s. It predates Benezet's work in the Friends School and certainly his education of women, which comes a little later. So I was never able to figure out exactly what that educational experience was. My guess is that it took place in one of their houses. They were all, remember her stepfather is this elite Quaker, as much as a nasty guy he is. So I think they're all elite Quakers. Benezet is probably educating them privately in one of these elite Quaker homes. But it's a remarkable cohort of women, now of whom, 3 of whom, you know, have their, you know, have an extended amount of their first person writing in print.
I do just have to say one more thing. When I think how exciting it is that I touch my phone and go on Facebook and I can instantly have contact from friends in Herrenhood. And how hard that must not, she didn't know what our life was like now, but how hard to wait for 40 years. And I really, as I read your book, you know, and I read those entries, how pained it was for her that she was not getting responses from her relatives.
Even in a good correspondence, even in a quicker correspondence, you know, she waited 6 months, you know, to hear back. Even when she was writing to Philadelphia and Drinker, sometimes the letters would arrive in 3 days and sometimes it would take them 6 months, depending on whether she used the post office, whether she used a bearer, somebody who actually carried the letter. Correspondence was a tricky thing.
Identify with that. Scott, I feel this question is based more in 2020 probably than the early 1700s, but how does a conservative reconcile living in basically a socialistic or communistic society?
Well, that's a tricky one. I'm not sure if she would have seen there was anything to be reconciled. You know, I think her conservatism comes out of a sort of millenarian sense that you know, if not evil, degeneracy is sort of spreading. That you know, degeneracy is spreading. Licentiousness, it's that kind of sort of moral disapproval more than sort of a way to arrange communities economically. So I think it was sort of a moral conservatism. I don't think she would have seen the communal economy that she lived in under Bethlehem as sort of a particularly progressive or liberal. I think she would have seen that in a religious context, you know, as a way of
Yeah, you make a reference a couple times in there. She read a newspaper article in the 1790s about some end times reference coming up at the millennium, and I was wondering because I know millenarian thinking, thousand-year reign thinking, was a big part of the church earlier. Was it generally thought of at the 1790s, or was Mary Penry an outlier theologically in that sense?
I mean, Paul gave a great paper on this a few years ago, not to put him on the spot. I mean, she wasn't an outlier in the culture at large. I mean, there was a lot of millenarian thinking, and she trades stories all the time, and she reads mainly non-Moravian religious texts, sort of predicting various things and debating on when the millennium turns. You know, is it the year 1800 or is it 1801?
We just lived through 2000. We all had a similar thing.
Yeah, right, exactly. So I don't think she's an outlier in the larger culture. She's participating in sort of a fever. I'm not really sure to what degree the Moravian church as a whole, or church thinkers, participated in that.
Others.
Do you have a sense in which she participated in the rest of the life of the community in Lidditz beyond the single sisters?
The rest of the community, meaning did she interact with other choirs, things like that?
She on a board outside, some board oversee, or
yeah, she was a acolyte, but she was never on any board. She never served on any of the various committees. It's interesting to me, I never thought of it till I read that Gambold letter today, because it was the letter in Salem, that she clearly had, so let me just go back one step. So in her letter, she mentions a lot of other people in Lidditz. They tend to be widows or married couples. But reading the letter to Gambold today, it occurred to me she clearly had a relationship with a single man as well, you know, a friendship relationship. So my sense is that the things we often hear about the degree to which the sexes were segregated, maybe this is sort of an earlier thing, you know, Bethlehem, it's usually talked about in the 1750s, 60s, where the sexes were really kept closely segregated. In this case, seems not to have been the case, in the sense that Mary Penry certainly had developed a relationship with John Gambold, the head of the Single Brothers, and I don't think they did it because they were on a committee together, because she wasn't on any committee. I mean, my sense is she had a full life in the community, but it was largely centered around her in the community of her family of sisters. Although again, she does write in a number of her letters about married couples that she knows that are in Lidditz. Can't remember too many other single brothers she mentions in any kind of intimate way, although she certainly knows the gossip about them, which she conveys in various letters.
Scott, she has a lot of references to Quakers and the Church of England folks. I was struck because in an earlier life, I worked at Penn under a fellow who was the Joseph Priestley Professor for History of Science there. And Priestley comes under an unusually strong attack from a Moravian woman. Yeah. She says, I have never saw nor heard P. underlined sleeve. She refuses to spell out his name.
Yeah.
But that he is a deist and glories in his infidelity, propagating his pernicious doctrine to the utmost of his power is a melancholy truth.
Yeah.
A lady in Lancaster told me she had heard him, and his oratory was such there was scarce a possibility was to withstand him. Had this wretch been drowned in the ocean on his passage hither, it would have been for the benefit of thousands who swallow the poison with avidity.
Not very
Pretty
charitable.
strong.
Yeah, right. And that's part of the answer. I should have been quicker in giving to Hank's question. It's that kind of conservatism where anybody associated with deism, was advancing the sort of end of times. So
But
Priestley
also the
is there with
abuse
Jefferson
issue.
and others. Sorry.
If her mother was abused and she was in that situation, she definitely would have built up that sense of protection, and I think.
Yeah. Yeah. She says in one letter that she's just writing in one of her letters, and she starts rattling off all the people she knows of different religious denominations, Presbyterians and Reformed and Catholic. She says, no, not Catholic. She says, it's strange. She realizes it while she's writing it. She says, it's strange. I don't have one Catholic friend. And she sort of reflects that she had grown up and surrounded by Catholics, even though her family was Anglican. Yeah.
Other questions tonight? Scott, I appreciate you sharing this stuff with us. I have put a link. We have a copy here in the office. We have been reading and enjoying. We have posted, there we go. We got several, everybody can hold up their copy. And if you don't have a copy, we have a link that we've got on our Facebook page. And when we post this, we'll put the link again to sell a few books your way, I hope, because a lot of effort. And I couldn't believe the amount of detail you put in the explanatory footnotes, which is really a separate running text from, you've got the story, but then your story of weaving all of her references and to getting a reader who is not, if you don't have to know anything about the Moravian experience, to come in and enjoy this collection of letters, because you place the audience in a good position to understand things. And
I'm always happy when someone reads the footnotes, because it's as Tom knows, it's just an enormous amount of effort, which you sort of imagine will have absolutely no impact at any moment ever. It needed to be done, but you never know, So
the footnotes are the breadcrumbs for the next researcher. So all of those who research appreciate footnotes. So we're grateful for that. If there's not any other questions, our tradition here is when folks have said all they want to say, we'll let everybody go home. Anything else, any word for the cause or any other things going on? I know we're going to have, is the videos that you showed at the opening on Tuesday, Paul, are they going to be available online?
Yes, there's a video online of Katie Fall's talk, and there is an overview with a few items from the exhibit as a PowerPoint that's also online.
Wonderful.
I hate to say it, Eric, but on my screen it doesn't show record. Does it show on yours?
It's showing all of me and whatever. Let's see, speaker view.
Okay,
Is it showing everybody now? Let's see. I can make it show everybody.
No, I mean, I see everybody. Just the record button doesn't
that's
look
good.
red on my screen.
I have no clue what the recording is going to show. I'll just tell you that. I'm that technically efficient. But I trust that it will have something, and that people will have gotten your wonderful talk this evening, and they will appreciate the intellectual clutter around me in my office that tells me I need to clean one of these days. But your bookshelves are much better. Mary, and yours are much better too. So I'm now challenged. I will get my office straightened out. That being said,
seeing the best one.
What?
This is one of many.
I am in that situation. In fact, I have a storage unit full of bookshelves. So that's how bad it gets sometimes. Scott, thank you much for
Thank
tonight.
you all for coming to listen. Thank you very much.
Send love your way. And everybody, if you want to be on the regular mailing list and don't currently get our MSC things, just send us an email. we'll put you on it. And that's the same for anybody who's watching this at a later time. We'll be glad to add you to that mailing list too. In the meantime, as we're getting ready to head to Central Time in Nashville, Tennessee, everybody have a great evening, and we'll see you next month. Thank you.
Everybody.
Thank you, Scott. Good
Thank
seeing everyone.